is near and dear to my heart. It's a fascinating story, and we'll get right into it. But one thing that it made me think of, as I read through the story of Esther, there's so many ways that you can take it. So many lessons that you can draw from it, and things that we can learn. One is such as the song the choir sang, the fact that Esther, I mean, you think about what she did, it was pretty amazing. You know, it took a lot of guts. It was very daring, almost brash. And the fact that she stepped out in faith and did what needed to be done. And that's definitely one way that you can look at this. I want to take a bit of a different look at the entire story. As you look at the story as a whole, there's just something that kept coming up to the surface. Now, how many of you guys recognize this kind of scene? You can flip to the next one here. You guys ever read these books? What are they? Where's Waldo? I don't even know where he is here. Maybe you can see him. But they always had, like, you know, he's the guy that was wearing the stripes. He has the hat and the glasses, you know, and you're supposed to find him in these pictures of people all over the place. And they always had something in there with the same kind of stripes, so you'd think that was him, then you'd find out, oh wait, it's not. And so people play all kinds of gags and things like that about, where's Waldo? Okay? Sometimes, doesn't it seem like God's that way? I mean, not to be disrespectful at all, but you see it in the Psalms too, where the psalmist says, Lord, where are you? I know you're supposed to be here, but it doesn't feel like you're here. Have you abandoned me? Have you walked away? What's going on? Sometimes in life, that's exactly the way that it feels. And we feel like we're looking for Waldo. And it's, where is God in this situation? Why does everything just seem like it's going wrong? And the book of Esther seems a little bit like that. Typically, the book of Esther sometimes is portrayed this way, like it's the Christian Disney princess, right? You know, so, oh, it's Queen Esther. It's just a lovely princess story. And that would be nice and all, but when you really look into the story, it's not really a nice story. You know, it's not like just nice stuff goes on. There were some really, especially when you start looking at the characters, there were some lunatics in the story. And we're going to get into that, and that's where it really gets interesting. People have had problems with the book of Esther. As I mentioned before, there is no mention of the name of God or of prayer in the book, and that's been an issue for some people, including Martin Luther. He actually wanted to kind of do away with the book and say it doesn't belong in the Bible because he saw no mention of God, no mention of prayer. But there is a reason for that as well, which we'll get into. So who is the hero? Well, Esther is certainly the most heroic. On a human plane, as you start really looking at what's going on in the book, it's hard to really find a hero that surfaces, apart from perhaps Esther. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on there. But the point of this is, the story itself tells us that there's something greater going on. Even though God's name is not mentioned in there, you cannot help but see his hand moving in every event that happens. And so we're going to take a moment this morning and we're just going to look at the whole story and see what God has to tell us. Let's start off with a word of prayer. Lord, I come before you this morning a broken man, Lord, having no right to open your word apart from the fact that you commanded, Lord, that these are your words, and your words are truth, and it's your word that changes our hearts, Lord, to change me first this morning. Lord, I pray that as your word goes out, as we see what it is you have for us today, that our hearts might be changed as well. In your name, amen. So, I want to talk about the story behind the story of Esther. Because there's, again, as I said, there's just a lot going on. So first of all, this takes place, where does this take place? It's not Israel. Okay, we're talking about, it says that it's the city of Susa, or Shushan, depending on what you're reading there. It's close to a city that's still around. So this is in Iran. This is what some of the modern city looks like. Kind of a pretty looking place. But this was the winter palace in Persia. So we're talking Persian Empire. And this is where they would winter. And it says that there was a king. His name was, in the Bible, it says Ahasuerus, or he was also known as Xerxes. Okay, and so maybe between those two names, history might start telling you a little bit about this guy. Basically, as you start reading the history books, you find out this guy was a raving lunatic, as a lot of kings were, given to be. But this guy, he was a little special. Let me read you some of what this guy did. What was he like? Well, he was impulsive. He was given to anger. He wasn't exactly a successful military king. So consider this passage from a Greek historian, talking about King Xerxes. They then began to build bridges across the Hellespont from Abydos to the headland between Cestus and Madatus. The Phoenicians building one of the ropes made from flax, the Egyptians building a second one out of papyrus. But no sooner had the strait been bridged than a great storm came on and cut apart and scattered all their works. Xerxes flew into a rage, and he commanded that the Hellespont, the water, be struck with 300 strokes of the whip, and that a pair of foot chains be thrown into the sea. It is even said that he sent off a rank of branders along with the rest of the Hellespont. So he's going to brand the water. Sounds successful. He also commanded that the scourgers speak outlandish and arrogant words, such as, "You hateful water, our master lays his judgment on you thus, for you have unjustly punished him, even though he's done you no wrong. Xerxes the king will pass over you, whether you wish it or not. It is fitting that no man offer you sacrifices, for you are a muddy and salty river." In these ways he commanded that the sea be punished, and also that the heads be severed from all those who directed the bridging of the Hellespont. So you want to talk about, unjust wages and that kind of thing? Well, yeah, this guy was the king of that. And this is what you see even in the scriptures. This guy he was impulsive. He flew into fits of rage. There's another account of a man named Pythian the Lydian. And this man had offered King Xerxes, I think he was from the area of Philippi or something like that. But he offered King Xerxes all of this money as he was coming through, basically buying him off, saying, "Oh, you are such a great king, I'll give you all this." Well, Xerxes was so moved by that, he said, no, that's really kind, but you keep your money, what a great guy, and just really gave him all this affirmation. Well, a few years down the road, as Xerxes is building his army, you may know the story of Xerxes moving against the armies and the 300 men of Sparta that held him off a little while ago. You know that whole story. Well, as that was going on, and Xerxes is moving through and he's building up his army, you know how it is, he's drafting everyone he can. Well, this man, Pythian, he was like, well, hey, I'm in good with Xerxes. He's already got 3 of my kids in his army. But my oldest, man, it would be great if I didn't lose all of my kids, to the army. So he goes to Xerxes and he says, hey, could I just have one of my sons to stay back so I know that I have at least one son for when I'm old? Thinking, that's not a big request, right? I mean, he's got thousands and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Well, again, Xerxes flies into a rage. And he is so angry, again, talk about impulsive, he actually has his army take the guy or the kid or whatever, cut him in half, put the 2 halves between the army, and he marched his entire army between the 2 halves. I mean, this is the guy that we're talking about. So, as we're looking at the king in the book of Esther, keep in mind, we're not talking about like a really nice guy. Okay, this is a guy who could be really nice at one moment and then flip and go totally bonkers. So, he was not successful in war. I mean, that's not what he was known for. He was known for building things, but when it came to battle, not so much. Massive upset when his navy got wiped out by the Greeks. And so in chapter 2, between chapter 1 and chapter 2 actually, there's a whole section of history that happens there where he goes out and he campaigns and just comes back with his tail between his legs. Just totally whooped. So, we see this in the story as well. The same brash king who's 1 minute one way and the next minute totally a different way. He rashly orders his queen to be deposed. Not sure if that mentioned that she was executed or not, but with this guy, who would be surprised, right? And later he regrets it. So in chapter 2, he turns around and goes, that wasn't such a bright idea, was it now? But now it's too late. Later on, he signs the way to have a whole nation wiped out. I mean, and it's kind of like, he just signs it and then goes on doing what he's doing without even thinking about it. Like, he didn't really think that whatever he signed was ordering an entire ethnicity and nation of people to be wiped out in Persia. It's like, you didn't think that went through. So there's just so many things like that. And that's our king that we're talking about. So now let's just walk through the story here and see what it is that God wants us to know. So the first scene, and I'm going to describe this like scene, so you can almost think of this cinematically. Scene 1 opens up, and we've got a pre-war planning conference and feast. So he has all of his generals, all of his officials together, and they're planning. All right, they're planning some of these attacks that he would later fail at. He throws an extravagant feast. I mean, we think, having a 2 or 3 day thing is something. This was a 6-month feast. So you imagine everything that went into this. It was just, he was putting his best foot forward. And it says that while he is drunk, he orders his queen in to show her off. And it doesn't say what that meant, but I think it probably was something more than just, oh, look how pretty she was. Because she was completely insulted, and she said, there is no way I am going to do that. I am not going to come before you. So not only is he probably asking something that's completely inappropriate, but now his queen is saying, absolutely not, I will disobey you right now. So, in verse 12 of chapter 1, again, we see the king's rage, like we mentioned before. And he does something rash. He says, fine, then no more queen. And it's interesting when you look into what he says there in chapter 1 and what his officials advise him to, they say, well, you know what, I mean, king, if she's doing that, then every woman in the kingdom is going to turn around to her husband and say, forget you. I'm not listening to you. So they say, oh, we got to make an example out of her. So, I mean, it's totally chauvinistic, but that's the culture that they were in. That's the way that they thought. Got to keep those women under thumb. That's pretty much exactly what they say. And so he deposes his king, or his queen, I'm sorry. And then he goes off to war. Scene 2 opens up now in chapter 2, and he realizes, after he comes back, totally beat, and he remembers, maybe he's thinking, he's coming home like, well, at least I have a queen. Oh, wait. Nope, that's not anymore. Got to think of something new. So he has his advisors come around him, and so they decide on the Persian beauty pageant of 483 BC. Okay, and that's organized, and that's set in motion, and again, it's this huge deal. And so he has all of these women pass before him, and he's going to choose a new queen. Now the book takes a moment here and brings in the Jewish element. So now enters the Jews. Why were the Jews still here? Because Cyrus had already decreed that they could go home. Okay, so, and next week we're going to get into more of the Jews out in exile. But right now they are in exile. But after so long, God even prophesied that they would be allowed to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. And that's where you find the stories of Nehemiah and Ezra and all that. So that's going on. That's already happened. But there's still Jews who stayed back, who decided, you know what, we could go back and we could break our backs working and building the city, but, Persia ain't so bad. It's pretty nice here. The accommodations are nice. I got a good job. I think I'm going to stick around. And without villainizing them, the fact is that they had the opportunity to go back to their homeland, but they have chosen to stick around. And now we get another character coming in, Mordecai. And this is Esther's cousin, who raised her like she was his own daughter. He comes from, interestingly, the tribe of Benjamin, a descendant of Shimei and Kish, which tells us that he was probably a descendant of King Saul. Tuck that away. Okay, remember that for later. So now he has Esther, or her Jewish name was Hadassah. What does the Bible say about her? It says that she was beautiful in form and that she was good looking. And of course that's what the Persians were looking for with the beauty pageant, so they pick her up and take her to the palace. And it doesn't sound like, I don't know that she applied for this. I think it was more like they came knocking on the doors and said, you're coming, you can stay, you are coming. I think it was something like that. So she probably didn't have a lot of choice about that. And so in essence, she becomes part of the king's harem. And I mean, from a Jewish mindset, this is just a whole other set of, wait, what? What's going on? Now we've got a Jewish girl in the Persian king's harem. And this is just a really odd set of circumstances. And you could imagine for the Jews and probably for Mordecai looking at this thinking, what is going on? And so he tells her, whatever you do, don't tell them that you are Jewish. So the stakes are high. And fast forwarding a little bit, she does very well, and she makes it. She becomes queen. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, which we won't. So we'll just kind of fast forward through this. And now the story takes a bit of a twist. And in scene 3 now we open up, and it's a very short snippet, actually. You know, it'd be like a little 10-second thing. And Mordecai just happens to be in a place. And this is something you're going to see as we go through here. He just happens to be in the right place at the right time. And he overhears a couple guards talking about an assassination plot against the king. And so Mordecai runs, he tells Esther. Esther tells the right people, tell the king, they find out what's going on, and they take care of the situation. And then the story ends right there and moves on. Okay, so again, it says some of these things like, oh yeah, Mordecai, he's related to Saul. Oh yeah, there was this thing where he found out this plot, and that got put to rest, and now we move on. But tuck it away for later. Now we enter the bad guy. So bad guy music, please. And here he comes in, all dressed in black, probably, right? So scene 4, now we introduce Haman. Haman. Right? The name sounds evil, right? But he's a very specific guy. Because have you ever wondered, why did he have it out for the Jews? I mean, what was his deal? Like, it just seems like everything he did, you know, Mordecai did one little thing, and now he wants to kill all of them. Well, there might be more to it than just he's a very hateful guy. It says in the story that he is an Agagite, which may not mean something to you unless you connect him with Saul. You might remember, back in history, there was a time where Saul was supposed to go in, and he was supposed to clean house. He was supposed to destroy everything, kill the king, just do the deal. And God said, I want everything destroyed. And Saul thought he knew better than God. So he said, well, I'm going to keep this, and I'm going to keep the king alive, you know, probably to make a show of him or something like that. The king's name? Agag. Now, we don't know how long he was alive. Eventually, Samuel put a rest to that and put him to death. But it seems like there is a link between Saul's disobedience here and the fact now that Haman is around. Why does he have it in for the Jews? Perhaps because he is related to King Agag. And now here's Mordecai, related to King Saul. And it's the whole Saul-Agag thing down here through history coming back up again. Because Saul disobeyed, now the Jews are threatened. It's a fascinating thing, but Haman's not just a hateful guy. There's some history going on behind here, I think. So, he suddenly shows up. Haman had serious issues with Mordecai. First of all, there was the whole lineage thing. But second of all, Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. We're looking in chapter 3, verses 1 through 15 is where we're at. And, you know, you want to think that this was, well, they were asking Mordecai to worship him, you know, like Daniel and his friends in the fiery furnace and that whole thing. But there's not really indication that that's what's going on here. I mean, the word for bow down and give reverence is kind of a general word. It can mean worship, but sometimes it was used like when Abraham was greeting visitors. That's the word that was used. So he wasn't obviously worshiping them. He was greeting them and giving them reverence and honor. And I wonder if that's a little more of what was going on here. That the king decreed, everyone, you are to honor and reverence Haman. He's my second in command. He's the guy. So when he comes down, you give him a bow and you honor him. And, you know, Persia is a more Asian culture, Middle Eastern. So there is more of an emphasis on that kind of reverence. So here's Mordecai, and for whatever reason, he decides, I'm not going to do it. Now, I don't want to try and villainize Mordecai, but I think there's something more than just Mordecai was being a good Jew and not worshiping a man. I think there was some irreverence going on. And so that gets Mordecai in big trouble. In fact, the people that he works with say, Mordecai, what are you doing? The king has actually set out a decree saying you need to do this. So why just get down? Just come on, stop standing up. But he kept doing it. So, and his reason was, well, I'm a Jew. And I wonder if because he said that, then Haman was like, oh, you're a Jew. Well, let me see if I can take care of that. Now I'm not just targeting you, I'm going to target everyone. So, and it's interesting because didn't he tell Esther, oh, don't tell anyone you're a Jew. But now when he's ticking off the second in command, he goes, I'm a Jew. It's like, wait, this is kind of backwards, right? She's not supposed to, but you're allowed to in this situation? This doesn't make sense. So, they find out that Haman has this big plot. and Haman's going to destroy all of the Jews. And when they find out in chapter 4 now, we switch scenes, and the Jews are weeping. I mean, wouldn't you? If you were to find out that all of your relatives and you were all in danger, and on a certain day, it was said, like on this day, the Jews will be exterminated. That's what the law said. And that's terrifying. Now you've got a clock counting down. Okay, and all the Jews knew it. So they're weeping, and news reaches Esther of Haman's plans. The stakes were high. Because Mordecai and this is where he tells her, maybe you came to this situation for such a time as this. And that's where the choir was singing. Maybe you were born for this kind of moment. Maybe all of this is coming together for a reason. And in fact, it was. But again, the stakes were high. Again, this is the king. When a guy came and asked something that was very reasonable, but the king thought it was the wrong time, he flew off the handle and did horrific things. And so Esther had to have known this. And so when we talk about the prospect of her going before the king, it's not just like, knocking on his door and saying, hey, are you available? It's like you're putting your life on the line, where the consequences could be horrific. But Mordecai brings in reality. He says, you're not going to escape just because you're in the king's palace. You're a Jew. It's not like that's going to protect you. And just maybe, just maybe, there's a reason that God has allowed things to happen the way that they're happening. So Esther resolves to do what needs to be done regardless of the consequences. Yes, she was the only one who could really do that. She was the only one that was in the position. But can you imagine the pressure? Can you imagine what she must have felt in that moment? Like, if I don't do this, all of these people will die. If I do this, I will probably die. And maybe they'll still die. It's just, the pressure had to have been immense. So now the next scene opens up. And so Esther puts on her best, and she waits outside the king's quarters. And when she goes in, miraculously, thankfully, she is accepted. And he holds out the scepter and that whole thing. But remember now, the Bible tells us they had not spoken in months. Okay, so again, it's not just the history of how crazy this guy could be, but they hadn't spoken in months. He'd been doing other things, and she'd been doing other things, and they hadn't spoken to each other. And so now she's going to come in, and she's going to make some big request. Talk about scary. But she doesn't just come right out and say, oh, king, this is happening, we need to do something about this. She's kind of clever about this. Because what does she request? She says, hey, could we throw a party? Could we have a banquet? Kind of not the first thing you'd think should be asked if hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives are on the line. You're going to ask for a banquet? That's exactly what she does. Notice there's two reactions here. Haman's reaction, he brags, because he's going, oh man, this is probably about me. Because I'm the second in command, I'm doing a bang-up job in this country, and this is probably going to be about, me. I'm killing it. So he he goes to his wife and his friends and receives some advice. And so he says, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to start planning for this whole killing of the Jews thing. So I'm going to build some gallows. Now, interesting thing about that, when you think gallows, you think of like the hangman's noose and that kind of thing. Erase that out of your mind. This is Persia, not the Old West. And you notice that it says 50-foot gallows. All right? So, who would make a noose that was 50 feet in the air? That's a little excessive, right? Well, again, in Persia back then, they weren't as nice about things. So we're not talking about a 50-foot noose. We're talking about a 50-foot shish kebab. Okay? If you need to know, that's how Persian hangings went. So we're not talking about a very nice thing. So he goes ahead and he starts building these things. And he gets that ready. Now the king's reaction was a little different. The king can't sleep. Perhaps he was perplexed about Esther's actions. Maybe she'd been acting strangely and he was wondering what's going on. Perhaps Haman was starting to worry him. Man, my queen's acting weird. My second in command, he's always been weird, but he's even acting weirder. And so it's interesting. He asked for the record books to be brought out and read to him. I mean, maybe they were short on bedtime stories. I don't know. And he thought, if anything's going to get me to sleep, the record books will definitely get me to sleep. So start reading. And so as they're reading, it just so happens that they come across the instance of Mordecai saving the life of the king. That kind of perks up his interest, and he says, well, what was ever done for this man? Nothing. It was just kind of swept under the rug, and that was that. So he says, oh, okay. I've got an idea. Hey, let's call in Haman. Oh, well, now it just so happens that Haman was walking by at that time. And so they say, oh, Haman, come on in here. The king has something to ask you. And in fact, Haman was there because he was coming to ask the king about the gallows, to get all the permissions signed for that and start construction of that project. Now, why was he doing this? I don't know. You know, why wasn't he sleeping? And why was he coming into the king in the middle of the night to talk about this? I don't know. But again, every time I read one of these details, it's like, well, it just so happened that Haman was here. It just so happened the king couldn't sleep. It just so happened. Perchance. You know, what a coincidence. And so while Haman is talking about Mordecai's death, the king is talking about wanting to exalt the very man that Haman wants to see put to death. And it's a fascinating display as these two, it's like they kind of don't realize what's going on until Haman has sat there and listed out all of the glories that will be laid on his very enemy. And so he unwittingly suggests the honor that he himself will perform for Mordecai. But what a twist of events, right? And when those tables finally turn, the king says, that's a fantastic idea. How about you oversee that being done for Mordecai? And Haman's face, I mean, you can see his jaw hit the floor, and his face, then he slumps over and just kind of walks out. And he goes home to his wife and his friends, and in chapter 6 and verse 13, you can read it there, they say, Haman, you're doomed. You're doomed. You know, and they were very superstitious people. But they look at the events going on and they're like, oh man, I'm backing up because I don't know what's going on here, but it's not looking good for you, buddy. So Haman's not in a good mood anymore. And now we move to the next scene, and in scene 7, it's 3 months later, I'm sorry, not just yet. We're still in the same scene here. So Haman's not doing very well. And so Esther calls for a second banquet. So she waits till the second day to really release things and to give her a true request. Look how she phrases her question when she finally asks the king. She says, all I want, let my life be granted to me. Because the king is, at this point, he's like, Esther, what do you want? I mean, these are great parties and everything, but what's going on? I mean, I can see something really on your heart. What's going on? She says, all I want is my life to be granted to you. And he's going like, what are you talking about? I mean, he doesn't know that she's a Jew, remember? And so he's, Esther, what in the world are you talking about? Who's threatening you? And even as he says that, she just points right over to Haman. She says, that guy, right there. And at this point, then, she lets him know that she is a Jew, and Haman's plot and all of this stuff going on. And all of a sudden, Haman's kingdom that he had is just crumbling all around him. And he panics. And so while he is begging the queen for his life, the king walks back in, and it just looks all bad. We don't know what's going on, but Haman was desperate, and that we know. And he is throwing himself at her feet. And when the king comes back in, he says, oh, you're going to try and pull this in my house? No way. And at that point, Haman's done. And they hang him on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Again, not a very pretty picture. But how the tables have turned. And who's turning them? You look in the story and it's like, well, it doesn't say who's turning them. But when you look at the story with the eyes of faith, there is no question who is turning these tables. And who in every event had things lined up just the right way so things are turning out. So now we move to the next scene. Haman's gone, but it's 3 months later, and the king's finally getting around to thinking about, oh, wait a minute, there was that whole proclamation that I made about the Jews and their extermination. I guess we never really did anything about that yet, did we? And so, he can't just scratch it. He can't just get rid of it. The way that they did things in the Persian Empire, when it was written down, that was it. and it was done, and it would be done. And so he couldn't just take it back. So he finally gets around to it. What he had to do is he had to send out another decree saying, all right, the Jews are going to be, for lack of a better term, it would be open season. That was basically what the original decree said. On this date, anyone can go get them. So the king sends out another one, and he says, on that day, you will have my military behind you, and here are some weapons to protect yourself, and, because, again, he couldn't take it back, so he had to make another one and hope that things would work out. Well, God was with them in defending themselves. The Jews completely dominated. And Haman's many sons that he was so proud of, back in chapter 5 and verse 11, you see him bragging about all of his sons. And in those skirmishes, as his sons were probably trying to do the very thing that he wanted done, they all lose their lives. And so this is, and the book of Esther explains, this is the feast called Purim, that the Jews still celebrate to this day. That's where this all comes from. And that feast is there to serve as a reminder for the time that God spared, an entire nation through the actions of Queen Esther. So, looking at the story as a whole, we see two things. First of all, man's failure in Esther. Throughout the story, as you look at what's going on, there's just so many things that could have it's like you're walking on eggshells the whole time. You're just waiting for the floor to fall through. Saul disobeyed, sparing Agag, and almost saw the extermination of his descendants. Esther hides her true identity and even her faith. Mordecai disobeys the king and almost gets his people wiped out. Haman was just sheer vengeful hatred. Xerxes was completely cavalier about a coming genocide in his kingdom. And Mordecai, in verse 14, you could even say that he left God out of Esther's place in the palace. There's just so many things where it's like, where is God in this? You see all of this crazy stuff going on, and people just reacting, and it just looks like it could fall apart at any moment. And yet, when you look at the story, you can't help but see that God is in every detail. For instance, in one of the king's typical fits, he completely deposes his queen. He didn't just typically do that, but he did that. If he hadn't done that, it wouldn't have made way for the rest of the story to happen. And Esther would have never been in the place that she was to see her people protected. Who made Esther attractive in the first place? Because, that's all the Persians were looking at. It says nothing about her personality. It was just that, she was beautiful. But who made her that way? God made her that way. Mordecai happens to hear a plot, and it just happens to be forgotten until the right time. The king just happens to accept Esther twice after not speaking for many months. The king could not sleep on one particular night. Haman just happened to be walking by at that very time. Haman wanted to talk about Mordecai's death, while the king wanted to talk about his exaltation, his promotion. Haman is forced to honor Mordecai. Haman is hung on his very own gallows. Esther, even in chapter 8 and verse 1, it says that Esther gets Haman's house. There's, again, total turn of the tables. And who even helped the Jews overcome their enemies? Both decrees were in effect at this point. And you look at all of these things, and as I read the story, I keep hearing the words, well, it just so happened that this was there, and this happened at the right time. And it's not coincidence. It's not, what a lucky set of events. It was a God who may not be mentioned by name in the story, but is working intimately through every detail. So what? No matter how much man or we may mess things up, God can always use it for good. No matter what we may do, we do plenty that messes things up. We sin. We know what to do, and we choose not to do it. And we can make a big mess of things. But no matter how much we may mess things up, God is sovereign. And even if it doesn't look like He's right there, He is always working behind the scenes. And He's always there. It's not an excuse for sin, but rather a perspective for God's ability to make things right. And while we shouldn't necessarily emulate every character in the book, we should see God's sovereignty throughout the whole story. So what do you think God can't do? What do you think that maybe He's just not willing to do? To use you? Or to change you? oh man, you don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've been through. I don't know if it's going to work out. I don't know if God can really change this. How about changing a situation for the good? Man, you don't know the circumstances. Well, maybe I don't, but God does. I mean, God's been there. God knows. What do you think that God can't do because of you? I mean, maybe you passed an opportunity to speak to someone about Christ. Maybe you feel like you just totally blew it. I'll never have that opportunity again. Maybe it's something like you blew your testimony with someone at work, said something you knew you shouldn't have, or just whatever you did, you just know, I feel like I've blown it. And I've disrespected the name of Christ, and what am I supposed to do now? God can't use me. I've totally messed things up. Don't underestimate God. Don't underestimate what he can do. Maybe it's a sin struggle. God can't use me like this. Oh, maybe not like this, but he's the one that can clean. He's the one that can cleanse our sin. Maybe you're saved later in life and you're concerned about your kids. Maybe you didn't have the biblical training until later on and you have regrets or something like that. And you think, what can God do with this situation? Don't underestimate the God who can change the course of history. God is at work behind the scenes. And he can work despite us, but he longs to work through us. Okay, he can always work despite us, but he wants to really work through us. Don't settle for the God who can work despite you. Look for the God who can work through you. We serve a great God. Whether behind the scenes or in broad daylight, God is at work. He's at work behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. But even when we don't see him, he's still there, and he's still doing something.